So, welcome everybody to the session with Lily Konings. So, Lily is a product designer at Facebook in US. She's currently working on the future of Messenger and Instagram. In her free time, Lily writes a newsletter answering questions on how to build a career in design. So, Lily, welcome and please go ahead.
Awesome. Let me share my screen. Oh, actually, let me try that again to make sure I am sharing with sound.
Sure, take it down.
All right.
Yep, I can see a desktop for now.
Perfect. And then a slide.
Yeah, exactly.
Perfect. Okay. Hey, everybody. My name's Lily, and today I'm going to be explaining the difference between output versus outcome. So just a little bit about me. I'm a designer, and I've been a designer at a variety of amazing companies. And when I lay out my career, especially like this, I do find that there's a pretty noticeable path that goes from doing pretty obscure work to doing pretty highly visible work. Starting at the very beginning, 7 years ago, I started off by working at a bunch of early stage startups. We were anything between 2 people hunched in a basement to 10 people hunched in a basement. So really, really small operations. And as some of you probably know, 90% of startups fail. So most of my work there really never saw the light of day because we couldn't find product market fit and the idea kind of died before it got past 10 to 20 customers. And then I moved on to IBM in 2016, where I built AI services that were personified as Watson, very famously. And in a global, well-established company like IBM, I had much bigger opportunities there to reach wider audiences and had much bigger impact. But I also happened to be part of a still pretty young and experimental sector. So a lot of my work there mainly stayed within the grounds of just a couple of test sites around the world, but still significant work for sure. And then I left IBM to join AngelList. My user base at AngelList was pretty significant compared to IBM because suddenly I was working on consumer-facing products that serviced 4 million active job seekers. And we were still a pretty fairly small company. My work there were often in the hands of our users in the matter of weeks rather than years. So certainly learned to design for scale very quickly. And then fast forward all the way to now, I work on Messenger and Instagram at Facebook, where 1 billion people use our services every day. And so highly visible is definitely an accurate way to describe my work today. And that's all to say that's really awesome. I'm very lucky to be where I am, and I am incredibly grateful to be part of a team that values design excellence very highly and get my work in front of an incredible amount of people. And on paper, that career trajectory seems like a very successful one, especially because designers ultimately produce very visible things, whether it's a website or a mobile app or even just a print design on a poster. Our work is visible to the eye. And so the more people who get to see it, experience it, and hopefully enjoy it, the more successful we're often deemed to be. But I've kind of come here today to debunk all of that and challenge the notion that a designer is largely defined by what she visibly creates. Because design by itself, or at least the things that you can see, that is just an output. And producing that output, creating that tangible interface of the product we work on is just table stakes for what we do as designers. It's the bare minimum for us to call ourselves designers. It lets us play in the game and puts us on the map, but choosing things like colors and shadows and interaction patterns accomplishes nothing if it's not applied with purpose. And so I have a really funny little clip here to show you guys. It's an example of what happens when you focus solely on output. Just some background, I play tennis for almost a decade now, and I hope there are some tennis fans in the audience. But this is a clip from a really funny movie called 7 Days in Hell, where Kit Harington plays a tennis player being interviewed because he has a shot at becoming the world's #1 player. But the character he plays is not super bright. And when he's asked what his strategy is to win, he focuses purely on the output, and it comes across as being really hilarious.
So, Charles, you're now number 2 in the world. You're favored to win Wimbledon, which would make you number 1. How do you do it?
Yeah, well, when I'm playing, I serve the ball, and the man opposite me on the other side of the court, he plays it back to me. Now then, I try to hit to a place in the court that he's not standing anymore. And if he manages to reach that and play it back, if it lands short, I run forward, and then I try and get it to another place in the court that he's not standing anymore. And sometimes it goes outside of these lines on the side of the court, and if that happens, the ump, he shouts, "Out!" And that's very bad if that happens to me, but if it happens to the other player, I really like that.
I understand how the game of tennis is played. I guess I meant, what's your overall strategy?
Yeah, indubitably, yeah.
Okay. You know, Charles, you can't help but compare.
Yeah. So I mean that's really funny. I really enjoy this movie. But you know, Kit Harington's character, like I said, is basically describing the basic game of tennis, which is just hitting the ball back and forth inside the lines, and that's essentially his output in a nutshell. And obviously, it's funny because he's oblivious to how listing a bunch of outputs doesn't lead to outcome, which is actually becoming the world's #1 tennis player. And so the point that I'm trying to make is that output does not equal outcome. Producing a beautiful interface only matters when it's applied with intention and with purpose. And if we are to become successful designers, we are striving for great outcomes, not just great outputs. And a great example of when intentionality mattered more than the outcome, the output itself. In 2011, IBM's Watson computer competed on Jeopardy against the show's 2 biggest all-time champions, and it won. The accomplishment wasn't so much that Watson was able to hold like an enormous amount of knowledge, but that it was able to take very complex natural language inquiries. Because if you've ever watched Jeopardy, you know the prompts on Jeopardy are often full of wordplay and nuances. But that it was able to take all of those complex inquiries and then arrive at a singular answer from more unstructured data that it was later, beforehand fed. And when I was at IBM, I worked on Watson, and after the success of Jeopardy, we wanted to know how we can apply those same accomplishments that were demonstrated on that show to the context of healthcare. And we tackled this from a lot of different angles. I worked on everything from using AI to improve the medical literacy of cancer patients, to detecting when electronic medical records were filled out incorrectly by doctors. But the most notable thing that I worked on was an exploration of how AI can be used to detect breast cancer from screening mammograms. And screening mammograms are basically this very standard procedure that all women get once a year once they turn 40. And basically only about 5 to 10% of those women get called back for a follow-up. And then a very, very tiny portion of those women actually have breast cancer. But screening mammograms is an incredibly important procedure. And in the US, at least, we're facing a shortage of radiologists to handle that demand. And so we were basically positioned to tackle that issue. And this is a extremely reduced, trimmed down version of what we actually built. But what would happen is that a radiologist would see a list like this every day and go through it one by one to read and report any suspected findings. We would essentially just attach ourselves to the end of that list, as you can see on the far right, with basically like a Watson dedicated column. And what Watson would do is that it would flag certain studies as high concern, meaning that Watson's already checked this out and it seems suspicious, you should read it first. And in theory, it seems to be really useful, but it had a myriad of problems. Problem number one, it was becoming increasingly clear how complex it was to pick up early stage signs of breast cancer. Over time, our team learned just how nuanced reading mammograms were and how trying to flag every suspicious case was an incredibly hard promise to deliver. And then number two, even if Watson wanted to accomplish that feat, doctors couldn't bring themselves to trust it. in our research, radiologists' distrust of an essentially black box technology didn't lead them to perform any better. They would basically just redo the work that Watson already did, and any value that we attempted to bring would be offset by that distrust. So what did we do instead? We just had Watson indicate the exact opposite. So rather than marking suspicious cases, it would flag the 90% normal cases with no signs of cancer. And the reason why this solved our two problems was, number one, it was way easier to teach a computer to recognize the monotony of normal cases than it was to teach it to recognize every reason for why it wasn't normal. And then number two, doctors innately trusted it to do what was essentially resident level work. Doing a pre-read on a radiologist's queue of studies was a job that you often assigned to a resident that was still learning the ropes. And so we were basically performing a familiar role, except faster and hopefully way better. But from a radiologist's point of view, the work that we did now was lower risk and unlikely to fail. And what this change on the screen, as you just saw, was basically just inverting what we showed in the Watson column. Instead of lighting up high concern cases, it lit up normal ones. That was really the only visible change on this output. And the point that I'm driving here is that the problem that really needed to be solved here was not making the design prettier or more usable or fancier. All of the back and forths that we had with doctors and engineers and stakeholders amounted to an incredibly straightforward change in the design. But the thought that went into it took 4 months from discovery to delivery. But that's because what ultimately matters is that not what's on the screen, but the intention behind it, the intention of how it was going to be used and how it was going to accomplish our goal. We weren't playing around with details like colors or border radiuses or interaction patterns. In those 4 months, we were doing extensive research and trying to gain a deep understanding of the environment we were building in. And we definitely had our clear goal, which was to detect breast cancer. And we could have very stubbornly continued down that original path, insisting that we were on our way to accomplishing it. And it would have added more strain and effort on what was already a pretty ambitious project. But that would have been us delivering an output irregardless of intentions, or at least delivering it with very poorly thought out intentions. And just to prove to you the amount of thought that went into it, and just to list a couple of the trade-offs that we had to make, even in trying to detect normal cases in screening mammograms, every patient still has biomarkers that are unique to them. And so we still had to teach our computer to understand the difference between normal variations in the human body versus cancer indicating variations in the human body. And then on top of that, certain women are just at higher risk of breast cancer based on their history and demographic. And so therefore they required a completely different set of evaluations. And then beyond those like medical jargon and complexities that I just mentioned, we also had to work through incredible technical considerations of what was and wasn't feasible for us to accomplish. So those are just a bullet list of the huge amount of things that went into this pivot and going into that change of what seems to be an incredibly straightforward change in the interface. And all of that is to say, a designer's best work is accomplished outside of the screen. The pixels that we push are beautiful and gratifying because we get to see the results of our labor. But if you think that that's what makes you a good designer, you're going to end up being very short-sighted, because unless you know how to apply the output that you deliver, you're not going to find an incredible amount of success. And that isn't to discount the work that illustrators and motion designers and graphic designers do. They are incredibly craft-focused people whose success is often dependent on visual execution and delight. But even they know their work is meant to drive towards something. They know their work is to be applied thoughtfully and oftentimes with a good deal of restraint. And so how can you start applying some intentionality on your own work? Number one is you need to start understanding the bigger picture. Everything you work on contributes to something larger. It should be an effort towards an overarching goal, whether that is a company level business goal or a complex user goal. Everything we do is pulling on a lever within a very complex set of systems. What we think we do in a silo will always have a bigger ripple effect, whether you intend it to or not. So say you're tasked with redesigning the FAQs page, you might take that at face value and run with it and deliver a beautiful FAQs page that probably we all know and love. Or you might think about where this ask is coming from. Maybe the company is focusing on hypergrowth this quarter, and improving this page would reduce the extra strain on customer support. And that's when, once you know that, you can evaluate how big of an impact your work is driving. Maybe as you grow in ownership in the company, maybe even start questioning whether that is the right approach. Maybe better internal tooling for customer support is more worthwhile, or faster communication with customers via text message. Either way, you need to know where in the bigger picture you fit in and how the work that you do is meant to push towards a North Star, so that way the intentions behind your work becomes far more informed and thorough, and you'll find that you'll achieve success with purpose and confidence. And then next, a little bit more obvious, as I mentioned, your work can be found within a very complex ecosystem of many different things happening. And human behavior is definitely complicated and unpredictable, which makes designing for that system even harder. So some obvious examples of edge cases that you may know you have to design for are people who use different devices, people with erratic intent, or those with disabilities. And thankfully, stress testing your work and designing for accessibility is definitely becoming a more structured and embedded part of what we do as designers. But it definitely doesn't hurt to reemphasize. For example, if you are designing the input form for a customer to input their credit card information, don't neglect the users who might want to pay by Apple Pay or PayPal. The minority audience might be really easy to cast aside, but oftentimes will become the biggest markers of an overall great experience. And then finally, really understand your constraints. If you want to be intentional about something, it's all about understanding your constraints, whether it's time or technical feasibility, resource allocation, competing priorities, so on and so forth. The ability to deliver a sound solution despite those constraints is what sets your work apart. Designing for AI for me meant that technical constraints was always at the top of the list of concerns, and it can come to a boiling point in the balance between delivering something that is feasible and delivering something that is valuable. But outside of technical constraints, you always have other due diligence to keep up with that are less obvious. Maybe competing priorities between your team and another team on the same surface area of the product. And then in that instance, you would have to work with the constraint of their roadmap alongside yours. Or maybe you're changing one page positively, but that has a negative impact on another page. And now you have to consider that as a trade-off and have that as a constraint. So overall, ultimately, what I'm really telling you is that if you do have trouble identifying how you can be more intentional about your work, start by asking questions. Don't be afraid of being unsatisfied with the information you're presented with. Ask, why is this important? Ask, why are we doing this? And overall, over time, becoming aware and thoughtful and intentional will be second nature in your work, as long as the first step that you take is recognizing that your output alone is not enough. Awesome. So that is all I have. Super happy to answer questions.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Lily. And yeah, let me read some questions. For now, we have 3 of them. What do recruiters expect to see on a beginner's product designer portfolio?
Recruiters, beginner, I'm assuming you're saying that someone is, completely out of college or someone who's breaking into the industry for the first time. Certainly, I will admit at that level, you're probably going to be focused, 75% on proving you can achieve craft. And so proving that you know what good design looks like and feels like. So literally UI and UX. So at that point, you might be trying to even meet the threshold that I was talking about, that table stakes I was talking about, which is knowing that you can deliver a crisp, high quality design. And then strategy and intentionality is a layer on top of that. So for early designers, prove that you can meet the threshold and prove that you can start calling yourself a designer. But if you want to be a great designer, or if you're a young designer who's trying to go above and beyond, start applying intentionality to your design at that moment. So if you're designing a to-do list, understand what exactly about a to-do list are you making? Are you redoing the same, 5,000 dribble shots of a to-do list? Or are you understanding strategically, how does a to-do list fit into a person's life? How does it deliver unique value over the many, many competitions out there? Start thinking just a little bit beyond just, the very, very basic minimum. And then that's probably what recruiters look for.
Okay, there is a question that I'm not sure I completely understand. Isn't it that UI design is relevant for the UX research? Because if design is not intuitive, users will probably not gonna like it. I'm not sure I completely understood the question. I think it's about the correlation between the UI and UX, that the user experience affects how people perceive the interface. Because if they can't use it, they don't like it. So it doesn't look appealing for them.
That's not true. If you think about, there are definitely products that don't look pretty. You can think about Craigslist or Reddit or any of those examples. They don't look pretty, and millions of people use them. And so I think that assuming that someone won't use your product just because it's not pretty is not true. If you can meet product market fit without a pretty interface, it's just as good as a product as one that, or actually it would be better than a product that looks amazing but does not bring any value. And so UI UX is always hand in hand. Like the value that you're bringing is through great UX. It's when you understand what a user wants and you're delivering it through something that is usable and seamless and meets their demand. And then the UI, the visual components on top of that, only supplements those needs. For instance, the reason why we build design systems across a very large project is to make the user feel like it's a consistent product. They don't want to go from one side of the product to another side of the product and feel like two completely different companies built this and they have to learn completely new patterns. So the design system is basically creating that consistent look and feel. Even though it's so visual, it still delivers a purpose. There's a reason behind it, and there's no way that you can say, okay, if it's not good looking or without the slap of paint on top of it, there's zero value in it. Value is at the fundamentals, and then visuals only add on to it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And there is another question I think is very, very interesting. It's a little bit long. So it's a question by Jason. He's asking how important it is to show the process of work versus finished glossy design. He's saying that he's confused when some designers are saying don't include your sketches and notes because they're going to be overlooked due to the time constraints of the recruiter.
That is a long question. Can you say that one more time?
So Jason is saying that he's confused when some designers are telling him not to include sketches and notes in his portfolio because it's going to be overlooked by the recruiter since there is no time. So he's asking, is it actually important to put those sketches and notes, or it's just enough to show a finished glossy design?
Got it. Okay, I understand. So the reason why recruiters or your interviewers may not want to be looking at your sketches is not truly because of time. In all honesty, I think it's because they're not they don't produce any signal to whether or not you're a good designer or not. Every designer, good and bad, can do sketches. Every designer, good and bad, can do wireframes and do post-it notes and whatnot. That is just a part of the process. It does not indicate value. And so the reason why I wouldn't recommend showing those things is because at the end of the day, what you should be showing is why you made certain choices, not showing, oh, you went through the motions of doing design. And so, yes, you should definitely show the finished, polished design. It should definitely look and feel beautiful and usable and carry the point that you're making. But you should only really support it with a list of things that you learned, the big decisions that made you do certain things. Post-its by themselves don't do anything for me. I don't think sketches have ever, if in my like 5 years of doing interviews, ever really produced that much value. No.
I got it. Actually, I have like a follow-up question for that. And it actually slipped my mind. Sorry. When I was listening to you so attentively that I lost it. And never mind.
Okay.
I'm gonna ask a question by attendee. Daniel is asking, if two teams are designing in the same space, how do you decide the trade-offs? If team A and team B both have impactful designs to the customer?
That's a great question. So I run into that all the time, especially at Facebook. It's such a large project. We have so many people working on it. Unfortunately, there's no straight answer. It always comes down to context. What are you building? What are they building? What is your timeline? What is their timeline? How big of an impact is your work versus theirs? So you have to basically weigh all of those different factors to determine perhaps who goes first, or even determine that you can do your work in parallel. Both of you can do both of your intended work alongside each other, and it doesn't have to be sequential. So you just have to basically communicate the work that you intend to do, the timeline, the urgency, the impact, all of that to the team. They will present theirs, and then you'll talk about how to get both of your priorities done, ideally together, with each other, alongside each other. But worst case scenario, one of you may have to recognize that the other priority is higher, and then you just have to wait, or perhaps just sacrifice it for the sake of the overall product.
Got it. Thank you so much, Lily. We're unfortunately ran out of time. So if you have questions for Lily, please find her on LinkedIn, connect, and answer. I'm sure she might find some time for you. Thank you so much for coming, and have a great rest of the day. And thank you guys, and join the parallel session in the meantime. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.